Thus far? Yes, yes. Let's do it, church staff. If you have enjoyed yourself, can I get an amen? Amen. Amen. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today with you on behalf of the Black Seminarians Association and the Perkins School of Theology. My name is Minister Latasha Roberts, and I have the task of introducing a phenomenal, prolific lecturer, just as we've heard with Reverend Dr. Waters, in the form of a woman who's preaching, who is a professor, but more importantly, she is a child of God. Her name is Dr. Gina Stewart, and she is a pastor, preacher, visionary, mentor, and a daughter of Christ Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. Yes. She led the congregation, she leads the congregation at Christ Missionary Baptist Church since 1995. Educationally, she is the first African American female elected to serve at an established African American Baptist congregation in Memphis in Shelby County. Educationally, because I know we have some young people in the room, I want to call the roll call on how she is preparing herself and has prepared herself. She is a 1978 graduate of Memphis Catholic High School. She earned a Bachelor of Business Administration in Marketing. She has a Master's of Education in Administration and Supervision. She received a Master of Divinity degree, and she has attended the Harvard Divinity School Summer Leadership Institute, and she has received a Doctorate of Ministry degree. And now, if that's not enough, she's still committed to learning and growing in God's gifts and graces within her. She is she's in the inaugural class, pursuing a PhD in African American preaching at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. This is the first class. If you have not been on Twitter, social media feeds, looking at the pictures and the promos of their class of accomplished preachers that are committed to this institution of learning, you need to invest in looking at that. She has received so many awards from a variety of Greek-lettered organizations, and she happens to be a member of Delta Sigma Theta. That's right. Dr. Stewart is with us today. She's described as a person who is a woman with a heart for God and God's people. And I first became acquainted with this young lady when she was the first and only female preaching at Empowerment Temple's first 7 Last Words up in Baltimore, Maryland. She was preaching on a restorative justice offered by a redemptive Jesus. If the title alone does not move you to go and see how is Jesus restoring us in our own sin and helping us to witness to others, that's what she was asking us to go with her in her thoughts as divinely inspired by God. So today, without further ado, I ask you to pray where you are so that the preacher and the professor can show up for God today. Dr. Stewart, it is all yours.
Well, since you're eating, let everything that have breath praise the Lord. Come on, put your hands together and bless God. You know, we're in an academic setting, but food affects us the same wherever we are. Let me express my appreciation to Minister Latasha Roberts and Minister Christian Watkins for extending the invitation to share here at Perkins School of Theology. I want to thank the Black Seminarians here and all of the staff and administration and faculty who are here sharing in this lecture series. And certainly we want to thank God for the prophetic voice of Dr. Michael Waters, who has really challenged us and blessed us on today. Would you help me celebrate his genius and his prophetic witness on this afternoon. I'm also honored to share this platform with other prolific and prophetic voices like Dr. Frederick Haynes, who was here on last night and who always leaves the space reverberating after he has proclaimed the gospel. And also thankful for Dr. Zan Holmes, who will share, whose reputation precedes him as a powerful voice and advocate for justice. So I'm just grateful to be here to have the opportunity to make an attempt to make a contribution to this discussion and conversation. Certainly it goes without saying that there are many who could stand where I'm standing. One of them is in the room today. I told her I've been reading about her, Dr. Karen Baker Fletcher, who is in this room, who could very well stand here and offer her reflections. But for the time that is mine, and let me just recognize my homegirl from Memphis, Cribbins over there, Milana. She said, I remember you when I was 12 years old. And so I'm so grateful to see her. Can you help me celebrate my homegirl here today? I've been asked, though, to talk about teaching hermeneutics of justice from a womanist perspective. And as I was telling Minister Watkins, when Dr. Haynes reached out to me on behalf of the institution and asked if I would be willing to do a lecture on this subject, I immediately said yes, because as she mentioned, I'm already in school working on a PhD in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric, and my focus for my dissertation is around womanist theology. So, you know, it was helping me two ways. It's helping me to strengthen my work and my writing as one who is attempting to become a budding scholar. But also I felt as if, because I traffic in that area because of this bodysuit I'm in, it would not be difficult to talk about justice from a womanist perspective. However, as I began to really think about this topic and began to try to put thoughts to pen and paper, I realized how broad of a subject this is. And I began to say, what have I signed up for? But at any rate, I want to say at the beginning of this conversation that I celebrate Black seminarians for the topic because it is justice leaning. The topic itself is justice leaning because it reflects a vision of inclusivity that says that this institution and this organization dares to take seriously the epistemology and lived experiences of Black women, who are often invisible not only in public spaces, but in Black spaces, and often erased in dominant white circles. Now, I need to say at the outset that I'm speaking primarily from where I stand in my social location as a Black pastor and practitioner who happens to be female, who has pastored for almost 24 years in my home church. And I can say without any fear of contradiction that there can be no discussion of justice without adding women's voices to the conversation. So we celebrate the conveners today, and we celebrate the Black seminarians for adding this conversation. Even the flyer is making a rhetorical statement because it is teaching justice, not just because you have a woman's picture on the flyer, but because you're off inviting a woman's perspective to the conversation. And we know that womanist perspectives often prioritize women's experiences, women's voices, our traditions, that bring our concerns to the forefront in a way that legitimates our dialogue and invites us to the table as a source of knowledge. And I say that as I was writing this, I was reflecting on an experience that I had about a year or so ago. Well, it was right in the aftermath of the 2016 election. I had been serving with another pastor, several Black pastors in the city who were attempting to do something about the violence. We had formed an organization called UAV 901. And one of the things that had happened, Dr. Waters, was that another black male had died at the hands of an officer in the city of Memphis. And of course, the election of 2016 brought another level of tension to populations that we had previously been inviting to the table, but who, up until that point, didn't feel that they needed to be at the table. And I remember raising some issues to one of the clergy persons who was there, who I will leave nameless, his name and his denomination. But he brought one of his women clergy with him. And as I began, we were brainstorming at the table, and as I began to share my thoughts about what I thought we should do in response to the election, because so many people were experiencing fear and anxiety because of the attitude toward others, I began to offer my reflections about what we should do. And he immediately, now the meeting was at my church. He was drinking my sodas and eating my black food. Come on. And he commits to basically attacking me for just the idea that we had. Now I'm headed somewhere with this about, inclusion and justice. And so I said, well, we just brainstorming here. This is not anything that's going to be etched in stone. Brainstorming is about bringing ideas to the table. And so he continued to badger me about the thoughts and the ideas that I was suggesting. As I was sitting there seething, thinking about calling security to put him out, I looked at the woman who came with him. And one of the things that became apparent to me as we were in that meeting is that she did not speak until he gave her permission. And one of the things that I concluded was, in most spaces like this, you want my body, but you don't want my brain. But my body and my brain are connected. So my body can't show up, and I check my brains at the door. I'm saying that to say this conversation, or when we invite women to the conversation, it legitimates our voices as a source of dialogue and knowledge, and provides for us an intentional and contextual frame of reference. Not only that is biblical, relevant for interpretation of text and scripture, as you're talking about preaching Jesus and justice and teaching it from a hermeneutics, justice hermeneutic, but also for the way that we negotiate our spaces in our public life. This is not to dismiss or minimize the struggles of black men or white men or the poor or any other marginalized group. But it is to say that a hermeneutics of justice, as this topic that I've been given suggests, from a womanist perspective, must embrace a vision that is expansive enough to not only see black women, but also speak to the pain and lived experiences of black women. We know that in many spaces, the unique circumstances of black women, and I'm speaking about black women with particularity, but this could be true about women in general. In many spaces, women are often overlooked in contemporary theological paradigms, and often ignored in race and gender as well as class. And it didn't just start, because when we read church history, what we discover is that women from the time of the early church fathers have inherited a legacy of stereotypes, implicit bias, and systemic oppression toward women that date back centuries. So the fact that women even acknowledge a call to preach is monumental. When we consider what Aquinas, Augustine, and others have said about women and their thoughts about women, we must note that we have inherited systems and biases of oppression that are undergirded by the notion that women are less than fully human. And it is this societal system that keeps all of these competing oppressions in place. Gender bias, invisibility, and marginalization. This is why a womanist perspective when we talk about justice, in my opinion, is important. And we could technically say that womanism or womanist theology was born out of a response to injustice. Specifically, womanist biblical reflections arose out of feminine biblical interpretations and liberation theology. Dr. Renita Weems, who is considered a first-generation womanist, in her essay on womanist reflections on biblical hermeneutics, says that, I'm in the house, the professor's over here shouting, praise God. I'm almost on the runway, Doc, and I'm just getting started. Womanist reflections on the Bible underscore that the experience of white feminists and those of black male liberationist thinkers are not the universal experience of all marginalized persons. While feminist biblical criticism and black liberation are linked, they are not the same. Sexism is one form of oppression that black women confront, but racism is something else. And classism is something else. A womanist perspective underscores the fact that North American European women is the experience of North American European women, is not the experience of women in general, nor is black male liberationist thinking the universal experience of people of color. The universalizing tendencies of North American feminists have obscured their Eurocentric biases, seeking to homogenize women in general and women of color, especially without regard to differences of race, religion, nationalities, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic backgrounds. Likewise, while black liberation thinking and womanist criticism are inextricably related, the experience of African American women has not always been fully appreciated by male colleagues involved in the liberation discourse historically. Black liberation, and this is what brought on the conversation about womanist theology, tends to focus on race oppression in society, but fail to see oppression based on gender as equally unacceptable. Black theology emerged out of the Black Power movement, unifocal in critique, but focusing exclusively on white racism. It failed to address the sexism and classism experienced by black women, and thus Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas has noted that those affected by both the feminist movement and in the church and society and their own experience of sexism, black women began to take note of their exclusion and not inclusion of experience in black theology as well as the feminist movement. Historically, womanist criticism then within the theological academy emerged as a corrective to the myopia of both feminine and black liberation scholarship, believing that every marginalized group has a right to not only name its own reality, but find a language for mapping out its own vision of liberation. That's why this conversation is so important, because it invites women into the conversation about what justice ought to look like for all of us. So womanism and or black feminism has always centered itself, which is where I'm trying to land my conversation today, with intersectionality. Somebody shout intersectionality. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality about 25 years ago, but now it seems to be gaining traction in theological discourse. It is a way, intersectionality is a way to help explain the triple oppression that African American women experience. It is a lens through which we can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and it intersects. Dr. Mitzi Smith states that racism, sexism, and classism are interlocking forms of oppression for black women and other women of color, having significantly greater impacts on our lives in general. The intersectionality of oppression is evidenced in America's biased justice and prison systems. While women in general are incarcerated at double the rate of men, African American women are 3 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Hispanic women are 69% more likely than white women to be incarcerated. And black women are also victims of violent crimes, receive less media attention than white women, and are often dehumanized when their stories do make the news, i.e. Me Too movement. Was not started by Ariana, come on scholars, but it was a sister, somebody shout a sister, named Tarana Burke, who first coined the phrase Me Too, but it took Ariana, and we're glad she brought it to the forefront, but it is reflective of how our voices are often not prioritized, not just in theological circles, but also in public spaces. Law enforcement officials count on media cooperation to help solve crimes, and if the crime and victim are characterized in ways that discourage sympathy, the public is less likely to cooperate and more likely to blame the victim, i.e. Sandy Bland, who ends up dead after being stopped at a stop sign, who allegedly commits suicide. But Sandy Bland is just one of those voices or one of those names that actually made a hashtag. Because while we were calling Tamir Rice, and while we were calling Mike Brown, and while we were calling Freddie Gray and other black names of black men who also had hashtags, there were black women dying at the same time. Which is one of the reasons why Crenshaw, in her language of intersectionality, coined the phrase, say her name, to bring visibility to black women who were dying in the same way as black men. Social justice for black women in their communities continues to be a struggle against the interlocking forms of oppression because of the interrelated impact of race, gender, and class on black, brown, and yellow lives, and especially on the lives of women and children of color. Women of color who ignore race, gender, or class issues do so to the detriment of the larger community. If a black male focuses on race while ignoring or participating in gender bias against black women, he is said to exercise male privilege. If white women demand gender parity without regard for the impact of racial bias on black women, they are said to exercise their privileged position as white women. When elite women of color focus on racial or gender bias without regard for the impact of classism on poor women, men, and children of any race, they are exercising class privilege. But the public square is not the only perpetrator. While the black church has been a place and a source of comfort and encouragement, we have been sustained, we have gotten strength, we've gotten our praise on. It's been a place of community and nurture and privilege. It has also been a space of oppression for black women. We know that women comprise one of the largest percentages of the black church. And yet, the black church as a social institution has not been exempt from the effects of intersectionality. It is a part of the matrix of domination. It's played a role in maintaining hierarchies of power, a key player in reproducing systems of oppression throughout history through its support for the domination, subordination, subjugation, and oppression of women. It is the space where women can pay the money, but can't count the money. It is the space where women can cook in the kitchen, but not make decisions about how funds are distributed. It is the literal interpretation and misuse of scripture to maintain social and ecclesial inequality, and it is still the place where though women train for ministry, even as I look at this room, I asked Minister Latasha, how many women are in the room? There are 22 women in the room of this room of about, 30 or more participants. But many of these women who will graduate with advanced degrees, Masters of Divinity and Theology, are less likely to be hired for pastoral ministry than their male counterparts. When I was elected 23 years ago to pastor Christ Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, in the Deep South, there were people who contended that if the church elected a woman, that the church would not only split, but the people that stayed would go to hell. In general, what we see when we talk about a hermeneutic of justice for women, a hermeneutic of justice, again, I celebrate the conveners of this who've called us together, because this conversation cannot be complete without taking into consideration the contribution and voices of women. And then if we look at our politically charged climate that despises others, we even have Christians who support anti-woman, anti-immigrant, anti-people of color, anti-LGBTQ, anti-poor rantings, and policies of the present administration. And so a womanist perspective, in my opinion, makes a contribution to this conversation, not just from the perspective of gender justice, but intersectionality, because it has always concerned itself with the destruction of interconnected forms of oppression that impact women's lives, particularly for this conversation and for the sake of my lecture, Black women or women of color and their communities. We all know that women experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. Such oppressions include racism, sexism, and classism. And what womanist biblical interpretation seeks to do is engage, expose, dismantle, and correct interconnected oppression found not only in these spaces, but also in the way we proclaim the text or preach the text, our context, and our interpretations. All of us are familiar with ways in which biblical text, context, interpretation, our language, and even our silence contribute to the ways in which women, like the crippled woman in Luke 13, whom Jesus set free after she had been bound by a spirit of infirmity for 18 years. And yet, even though this woman had been free from her infirmity, the synagogue leader said to Jesus, it could have waited another day. Because her condition was not critical, but chronic. In other words, she had been in that condition for so long that one more day would not kill her. And so it is the same in which we see that women continue to be told to wait for our deliverance. Women continue to be told not yet because of the chronic nature of our oppression. Oppression for women is chronic, not critical. God help me preach. I know I'm supposed to be lecturing, but I feel like preaching. And much like the synagogue ruler who said to Jesus, there are 6 days to heal. Do it on any day other than the Sabbath. Because in other words, her condition is not critical. She's not having a heart attack. She's not pregnant. She's not in labor. What she is dealing with one more day would not have killed her. When I think about Reverend Shirley Prince, the preacher who preached my installation service, when I was installed as the pastor of our church, she quoted from the late Dr. James Hal Cone's book, God of the Oppressed, and she expanded on this same motif of how women are constantly told, not yet, to wait, to be patient, to wait to breathe. Most of us are familiar with the ways in which our interpretive interests and our interpretive lenses have not always celebrated or affirmed the humanity of women, and certainly have not always centered on issues of gender, race, or class in our biblical interpretations, theology, and church practices. For example, depending on our faith tradition, some of us were good and grown before we laid eyes on a woman preacher. And although we know the stories of Abraham and Sarah, Moses, Joshua, David, and Peter from rote memory, most of us had to come to Perkins to find out about Hagar. Miriam, Shiphrah, and Pua, Deborah, Vashti, Phoebe, and Junia. This is problematic because from a standpoint of justice, the majority of the faithful that sit in our pews are women. And not only are the majority of the faithful that sit in our pews women, the majority of the faithful that help make the budget, come on, talk to me now, are women. Dr. Ebony Marshall Turman says that while statistics indicate that black women comprise 85 to 90% of black church membership, personal experience confirms that without black women administering the ministry, praying for the pastor, teaching the children, singing in the choir, cooking in the kitchen, answering the phone, photocopying the bulletin, giving the tithe and the offering, and testifying about the goodness of the Lord, there would be no black church. And of course, we know that Reverend Cheryl Town Gills says, if it wasn't for the women, there would be no church. There is also the marginalization of women in preaching. Although times are changing, I know this is about teaching, but I traffic primarily in preaching circles, so for me, preaching and teaching is interchangeable. Although the times are changing, it's still not uncommon, although we are grateful for progressive voices like Dr. Waters and others and Dr. Frederick Haynes, but I still live in an area and live in an environment where it is not uncommon to still hear negative and derogatory caricature that belittles and marginalizes women in our sermonic and biblical interpretation. This means that many of us have probably heard sermon content that demeans and insults women and paints women in a negative light and derogatory descriptors, including, as the late Dr. Katie Cannon would say, sin bringing Eve, whoring Gomer, Mary Magdalene, who was the prostitute, but when we research her, we find out quite a bit different story and portrait and picture. That's another lecture for another day. Wilderness whipping ring Hagar, henpecking Jezebel, and conspiring Sapphira. Cannon further argues that if the sermons of the black church tradition or our teaching are exclusively in the interest of our male counterparts, it gives credence to androcentric, male-dominated, and masculine interests. In other words, when sermons are written solely from the perspective of maleness, and maleness becomes normative except for women's days and women's celebrations, women are then shifted to the margins. Katie Cannon also sheds light on the marginalization of women and linguistic violence that focuses on imagery and biblical interpretation. These elements include negative and derogatory female images, androcentric, phallocentric, focused on or concerned with the phallus as a symbol of male dominance, stereotypes that dehumanize and debilitate and are prejudicial to African American women, the marginalization of women in biblical text and context, discriminatory language and marginalization of women characters in the sermon, images that empower sexist wording or preaching that moves women to the margins and keeps our male counterparts at the normative center. In addition to linguistic violence, Clarice Martin calls it linguistic sexism. The instances in which in the Bible, where women are removed from the text, silenced, anonymous, or unnamed except by the person that they're in relationship with. All of these realities of race, class, and gender suggest to us why this conversation about justice from a womanist perspective is so imperative. Because as we have also noted about those of us who are women of privilege can be blind to our privilege as it relates to class, we also know that there are blind spots when it comes to the way in which we envision a vision of justice for women. All of these realities of class and gender, and we know the derogatory images of women and the marginalization of women in biblical texts are simply not consistent with the historical contributions of African American women in the life of the church and in public spaces. I just finished reading a book for one of my classes on doers of the word, a book called Doers of the Word. It is a book about 19th century black women for whom writing in a time where women should have been seen and not heard. These women whose writing and their involvement in public spaces became a form of social activism. That for women like Harriet Tubman and Maria Stewart and others, their writing, which those of us who do womanist studies, are seeing that they were writing and they were advocating. Jarena Lee and so many others were advocating in a time where it was not only dangerous to be black, but dangerous to be a woman. So what can be done to correct the problem? How do we counter these consequences of wording that we hear in our teaching? How do we ensure that we not only bring men to the center or class to the center, but also women to the center? How do we provide visions of liberation and dismantle patriarchy and the objectification of women? And how do we proclaim or teach a word that is life-giving and not death-dealing? As a clergywoman committed to the well-being of all people, not just women, but all people, can't do that and be a pastor. How will we refute the stereotypes that are dehumanizing and prejudicial? How do we shift these not only white supremacist attitudes, but male supremacist attitudes? How can we use the Bible to ensure that if little girls don't grow up in a church where the pastor happens to be female, that they will know that they're not just heroes in the Bible, but sheroes as well? What can we do to attribute to the marvelous happenings, not only in Scripture, but in our spaces, to a cast of both male and female characters that is liberating as well as life-giving? A corrective involves using the liberating strategies that encourage an ethic of resistance. An ethic of resistance not only in our preaching, but also in our teaching. In other words, I'm suggesting and proposing that we lift up theologies that rather than diminish the humanity of black women, that affirm. Theologies that teach that women too are made in the image of God. Theologies that teach and preach and give voice to the lament, not just of the Mike Browns in our pursuit of justice, but also the Rikisha McBrides, the Sandy Blands, and the other names that remain on the margins and remain invisible. That justice for women and all people becomes not just a hermeneutical concern for those of us who teach and preach, but that as we lift up those concerns, we also illustrate that they are a sacred concern for God. That we elevate conversation and how we speak about black women and to the issues that affect black women, the stories and the images that we choose to elevate, these things that we say, whether from our pulpits or in our public spaces, can make a determination of whether or not we speak life or death. That we will grapple with the way we present God as a God who cares about everybody. A God who cares not just about the struggles of a certain group, but about the struggles of black women, the concerns and the care of black women. It is a theology, I'm suggesting, that is intersectional in its application. Because we often only think about how sexism affects black women without any consideration to race and class. Even as we look at the race in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, who, I don't want to go there, who the chief executive was tweeting several days before election that she was unqualified to run for governor of Georgia. Ironically, she graduated from the same school that the person that they just shoved through a confirmation process for the Supreme Court graduated from as well. And so how do we grapple with our representation of a God who cares about one group but doesn't care about another group? A God who can be indifferent or apathetic to the concerns and the struggles of those who have been pushed to the margin. It is a prophetic call to those of us who preach and teach, who have the privilege of standing behind this sacred desk, to engage theologically and socially in resistance to ideologies, theologies that perpetuate oppression. In other words, in centering intersectionality, we answer the call for the least of these. And we position ourselves as leaders of the church, not as a complicit institution, but as a leader in a vision toward God's kingdom that welcomes and affirms and encourages and supports all of us in our God-given complexity. As I stated when I began, my primary vocation is practitioner. So I'll close my comments with a passage of scripture that I think really speaks to what I've been trying to communicate. In the 15th chapter of Matthew, Jesus has an experience with what we could call intersectionality. He encounters a woman in a place after he has had conversation and left the critics and the crowd. He encounters a woman, one text calls her a Syrophoenician, I believe Matthew calls her a Canaanite. She is having struggles because she has a daughter who is in need of deliverance. And when she asked Jesus to have mercy, Jesus' initial response to her is silence. He doesn't respond, and the disciples want to send her away. Thankfully, that this woman is much like many of the women that we see in our contemporary society who don't mind going to the mat for their children. It's kind of hard to get a soul sister to go away when she's fighting for her child. She continues to challenge Jesus and request mercy, and Jesus finally answers her and says to her, it is not right to take the bread from the children's bread and give it to dogs. I will admit to you, it was a long time before I could preach this text. Because I said to myself, Jesus, how can you call somebody a dog? He was in the land of what they call the little dogs. He was in a place where he uses a pejorative term to a woman who is 3 times affected by class, gender, and race. She's a Canaanite. She's a woman. And she's more than likely poor. And Jesus responds, first of all, with silence, and the disciples want to send her away. And he tells her essentially, or suggests by his response, that you need to wait for your deliverance. Because the first dispensation will be extended to the children, or those who are the children of Israel, the house of Israel. And she comes back and says to him, yeah, but even the dog. I know I'm in a seminary, so somebody ought to be shouting right now. Get to eat your crumbs from the table. In other words, what she is suggesting to him, you say, I know, and what I like about Matthew is that she called him son of David. She used the term which suggested that she had some type of template for who this God who was in the flesh was she was facing. And she says to him that even the dogs get to eat from the children's table. In other words, she's saying to Jesus, use your privilege to be who you say you are. What I would say to those of us who have this privilege to stand behind this desk and to proclaim this gospel, that with the same fervor that we challenge systems of oppression, institutions concerning white supremacy and other areas, as Dr. Waters so eloquently has done. And this is certainly not to suggest that there are not voices that do that. Dr. Frederick Haynes, who is a great friend of mine, who I'll be preaching for this weekend, is certainly an advocate for justice. But we cannot have this conversation about justice, teaching justice, as a hermeneutic from a womanist perspective without lifting up a challenge, not just for the brothers. Come on now. Because many of the much of the opposition, Lord help me right here, that I have encountered has not been from the brothers, but from the sisters. While I'm grateful for the legacy of women, and I must admit that there have been many women who have been supportive, there have been many women who have affirmed, there have been many women who have put wind beneath my wings, but the corrective is not just for the brothers. The corrective is also for the women who have internalized the oppression. So that when people like myself and Dr. Karen Baker Fletcher and Renita Weems and Raquel St. Clair and an Ebony Marshall Turman and others stand behind the sacred desk. God help me right here. We are received and our voices have as much validity and credibility as those who are in a different bodysuit. So the challenge is that as we stand behind this desk, that we use our privilege, not just to liberate some, but to liberate all of us. God bless you. If I was in church, I'd say the doors of the church are open.
Of Jesus and all that he's done for me. He lifted up black women and he challenged the brothers. So I thank you both, Dr. Williams and Dr. Stewart and Dr. Waters, for your prophetic witness. I thank you. Let's give them a hand clap of praise one more time. Now at this time we have a couple of minutes for some quick questions. I know the time is running short and I want to respect our speakers' schedules, because I know we have a driver on the way and more responsibilities to take care of. So if there are any questions, please let them be asked now. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, given your history at Christ Baptist Church, you've been there since you were a little girl, right?
Since I was 7.
Okay.
51 years.
I'm assuming, as usual, when there's a changing of the guard, that there are going to be some things that drift away, as they probably should. But I'm curious about, do you recall having some of the men of the old church who remained there with you, who were hesitant, but you've seen the transition and how they've accepted more and more of having a female pastor? Do you have experiences with that? And some of them, you had to also deal with the challenge of being a little girl from the church, and then learning how to respect you as you're their pastor now. I was curious, do you still have someone who's there now who is hesitant at first, but who's evolved to full acceptance of where their church is now with their present pastor?
And the short answer to that is yes and no. There were two specific groups. One group was the deacons. The deacons were very much, with the exception of one, and he's deceased, even though my pastor, because one of the reasons why the church was able, I believe, to elect a woman is because my pastor, who was Methodist by training and upbringing, he married a Baptist. Reverend Curry married a Baptist, but by training and upbringing, he was Methodist, so he did not bring some of the baggage about women to the pastorate. So while he was very much affirming of women being in ministry, the embedded theology based on our denomination was such that while they saw me in that role, they chose not to fight me as long as he was living. My pastor had a massive heart attack in a restaurant and died. And of course, the church had never had he was the first pastor, it's just two of us, him and then myself. And of course, it left the church in a quandary about who they would call. And I can very distinctly remember being called to a deacon meeting because we were initially asked, myself and one of the other associate ministers had been asked to preside over the pulpit during the time of transition. And I had been called and told that they didn't want me to preach anymore. And they called me to a meeting to say, we don't want you preaching because we believe, we were told that women ought not preach. And women ought not exercise authority over men. I can remember it like it was yesterday. They were sitting in a circle, and we went around the circle, and each one of them, with the exception of one man, whom I had had the privilege of extending pastoral care to his wife, who was dying with cancer, said, I don't care whether it's a man, I don't know about whether or not women ought not be preaching or not, but one thing I do know is that when she prayed for my wife got well for a little while. And so, but what happened is that even though they were opposed to my initial installation and becoming pastor, what brought about the evolution was pastoral care. Pastoral care brought about the evolution. Because even though they did not want me to be a pastor, they still wanted me to be little Gina. I showed up every time they were sick. I showed up every time there was a funeral. I drove to the country to stand beside them, to watch them lower their family member into the ground. And then the other thing that began to happen, when I would go to rural areas where the pastors felt the same way they did, and they saw the way I was marginalized in those churches as their pastor, it began to create a righteous indignation in them. Because it was no longer against me, they began to take it personal. So I would say that it evolved, and many of them, in fact, one of them now shouts more than anybody. I mean, when I first started pastoring, he used to sit back with his head bowed and would never say a word. Now he shouts all over the place because he ended up coming down with pneumonia, and he called and asked if I would come and pray for him, and I went and prayed for him, and he's been my friend ever since. So yes, to answer your question, it has evolved. The other bastion of dominance was with money. In the finance. And the problem was they wanted my body but didn't want my brain. And there was often a contentious relationship because they wanted me to help bring in the money, so to speak, but they didn't want me to have a say-so of how the money was spent. And so that was a constant source of, but time brings about all kinds of changes. And of course, over time, we were able to move people around so that those who had more of an embrace of the vision and the direction that God was trying to lead me in the church were eventually put in those roles.
Any others? Did you have? Yes, ma'am.
I enjoyed you both very much. Thank you for your words and your lectures. And I have a question for Dr. Stewart. When you talked about the sheroes in the Bible and telling the stories from a different perspective, oftentimes when we, come to seminary, we graduate, we learn all of these things. I was blessed to go to the ITC. I graduated from Gammon Seminary. And so I experienced seminary a lot differently, and even more different than even how I was raised. Hearing those stories and hearing the sermons from different perspectives. But it seemed like when you try to give it, it's not always received. So how do you continue to preach from a womanist perspective and keep telling the story from different lenses? And even when you meet resistance, what is your advice for us when we attempt to help people to see that there's more than one way to tell the story, more than one character involved, more than one lens? What's your advice, especially when you meet resistance?
Well, I think that from the standpoint of a pastor, I have a little more latitude. That's the first answer. Because not only can I address that from the pulpit, and let me just say too, that I don't talk about women every week, okay? Because the congregation is diverse, and so we have to speak to everybody that's in the congregation. But I think that one of the things that pastoring provides for me is a latitude or a broader, if you will, runway for lifting up those perspectives that are often not lifted up in our preaching moments. But not only that, I have the opportunity to incorporate it in discipleship as a part of the discipling component. And even when I don't necessarily talk about it explicitly, it can be done implicitly as well. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is every sermon doesn't necessarily have to be about a woman in order to bring that perspective, that lens to the text when we preach, because that is a part of what I have internalized. And so even in my preaching, I'm preaching from a lens, even if I'm preaching about Zacchaeus, who ran up in a tree to see Jesus, for example. I'm bringing a lens to that text that would be, and that's the genius and the beauty of preaching. So I think that's one of the things that makes it easier for me, but it also gives me a little more latitude as it relates to preaching. And then the final thing I would say is something that Dr. Renita Weems said in a seminar when she talked about, will we as women move the needle? Now that we have the opportunity to preach, will it be business as usual? Or will we take the risk to tell our stories? She said, and I wrote a book based on that challenge. She said, if we don't tell our stories, who's going to tell it? And so what that means is, even though it may not dump the house, as they say, people may not leave shouting, but at the end of the day, we have to decide, and this is a part of what the decision that I had to make as a pastor, not just as it relates to womanist theology, but relates to a transformational type of preaching. As Dr. Mafiko said to us on one occasion, we have to decide whether we want to be a masseuse or whether we want to preach transformation. And so there's an inherent risk, I think, that's always, present when you start talking about preaching from a different perspective. But he gave us some good advice too about doing our homework. The other thing that I often do in my preaching, I'm very image-based, and I'm a student of scripture and culture. So whenever I have an opportunity to use present or contemporary images as RLEs or real life experiences to connect people to the ancient text, I use that. This past Sunday, I preached about Stacey Abrams and Oprah coming to help her in Florida. And the title of my text was, "The Lord Will Send Help." And I talked about, how help often comes through human agency. But it was not explicitly a womanist sermon, but I was still lifting up, because if you recall, one of the things that we do in terms of correctives is not just in terms of the text, but the images, the examples, the illustrations that we use as well. So.
Thank you.
Dr. Waters, can you expound on that? Can you expand that or do it or work it from your perspective as well?
I've enjoyed learning and listening. I actually was thinking of my formation, Dr. Stewart, as you were speaking. My mother's father grew up in the church his grandmother established. And his mother, my great-grandmother, was either the first or one of the first, second woman ordained in AME Church in Texas. And the first woman to pastor. My mother, Brenda Waters, is an elder in AME Church. I have the privilege of serving under the leadership of a female bishop, Bishop Vashon Murphy McKenzie. And I have more daughters in ministry than I have sons. And I'm thinking of, I've been thinking about this generationally. And I'm posing the question, haven't arrived at an answer just yet, but I wonder if, as a borderline Generation X millennial pastor, if we look at the pulpit through a different lens, that invites more participation from God's creation than in previous generations. So I'm thinking of that. I also was thinking about the sermons I've preached about Lydia, the maker of purple, and how it is her genius that then funds the gospel movement into Macedonia, and how we fail to hear the reverberations of her contribution to fund and support the work of Paul. Thinking about the necessity of preaching about Tamar's experience. Because, unfortunately, that is the experience of far too many men and women within our congregation. I think the greater challenge that I had and I was taking notes, and I'll say this very quickly, a woman by the name of Aja Dixon. Some of you have never heard her name. She was murdered by Corsicana police in 2010. At the time, I was writing for the Huffington Post, and during one of our worship services, a woman came in, from the pulpit, you see everything. A woman came in who I knew had not attended before. She waited to the end of worship and asked to speak to me. She had a whole arm full of folders. And, people kind of said, well, do you know who this is? And I said, yes, I'll meet with her. Go in my office. She begins telling me about her daughter's death at the hands of the Corsicana police. She was from New York, and that all of the effort and work that they'd had over all this time, none of the files and information that they needed released had been released. And I made a conscious decision when I was writing Stakes Is High to lead into the conversation about police brutality with her story.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's interesting the impact that made is that people were reading about Mike Brown and others, and they wanted to know about who was this Aja Dixon.
Right.
And that has seemed to kind of press into her case, if you will. That was kind of a closed case. People are starting to kind of wonder what's going on here. And so when you began to masterfully exegete the text in terms of Jesus using his privilege in order, I would say masculine privilege as well as in the house of Israel, to advance liberation, I hope in the same way that as men, when we center as best we can women's experience and even highlight it and lead into it, maybe it opens doors that we have previously participated in closing.
And I believe it's Donna Allen who will call that also emancipatory praxis in her book, Toward a Womanist Hermeneutic. What she refers to are the ways that we not only can move women from the margins to the center in terms of our proclamation, but also in terms of our praxis. And so what you're doing in terms of, women being visible in spaces. I remember one of my church members said to me, are we recording this? Press pause for a second. I remember one of my church members saying to me, I'd asked her